Give God a hand clap of praise. Because that's who He is. I praise and thank God so much for who He is in my life. I praise and thank God for where He's brought me from. As I sit here and I watch them stand at this podium, I remember as a kid, anybody that knew me growing up, you would have never imagined that I'd be standing right here. Allie, the reason I was telling you it's okay is because I know what it's like to be so nervous standing right here. I would have never guessed that God would place me where He's placed me. To stand here with the confidence and the authority that He's placed upon my life, because there's a purpose. Because there's something that He's made me for. There's something that He's made each and every single one of us for. And I do not take it lightly, the grace that He has bestowed on my life, because I don't deserve it. And if you really sat there and just thought about it for a few minutes, if you thought about some of those things that you wish nobody could ever find out about, you would realize the grace that's on your life as well. And the power that's been shared with each and every single one of us. And I just thank God today for who He is. You can have your seats. I won't be before you long today. We are going to go to the book of Acts, chapter number 7. You will notice when I read, or you might have noticed when Matthew was reading earlier, more often than not, we will use the NLT version to make the Bible somewhat a little bit more understandable and relatable to the words that they're used to hearing. So it can be digestible. So I will be reading from the NLT version. The book of Acts, chapter number 7. We're going to start at verse 30. And we're going to read down and stop after that period in verse number 33. If you have it, say amen. I didn't hear that many amen, so I guess I should.
What chapter?
Acts, chapter 7. Starting at verse 30. That's a little more.
Yes.
Acts chapter 7, starting at verse 30. It says, 40 years later, in the desert near Mount Sinai, an angel appeared to Moses in the flame of a burning bush. When Moses saw it, he was amazed at the sight. As he went to take a closer look, the voice of the Lord called out to him, I am the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses shook with terror and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. If I had to give a topic today, my topic would be the right time. The right time. This verse is actually also in Exodus. One of the things that you realize in the last two messages that I gave, there were scriptures that were represented in multiple places. So in regards to God talking to Moses and saying, take off your sandals for you are standing on holy ground, that is also represented in Exodus. But I wanted to use this particular verse in Acts because it is being presented out of the mouth of someone named Stephen. Stephen was on trial, and the amazing thing about the fact that he was on trial is because they said he spoke out against Moses, which was their history. We're in the New Testament at this point. Jesus has died, and the disciples are trying to gather everything, get everything together with the faith. And they were having to focus on other duties. So they wanted to put in place some apostles. to actually be able to handle the normal day-to-day tasks so that they could focus on the miracles and the healings and the things of that nature. So these, I believe it was seven apostles. Stephen was one, and he was being charged with speaking out against Moses. Keep in mind, at the time that Jesus came in, the Jewish religion is what was very big on the scene. So anything against the Jewish customs was looked down upon very much. I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. So Stephen was being attacked and on trial for speaking out against Moses. And if you look in Acts chapter 7, what he is talking about is the entire history from Abraham all the way up through David. And in this particular portion of the history lesson that he was giving, he actually touched on everything that was going on with Moses. So I said all that to say, and to bring us into my first point in regards to today, is to recognize the conditions. First point, recognize the conditions. As I mentioned, Stephen was given a history lesson. He's on trial. He's potentially about to die. And he's being placed on trial because they said he was speaking against Moses. So in the midst of being on trial, he begins to speak about the very person that they said he was speaking out against. So one of the things that I think we do very much in the Christian faith is we're able to look at the Bible stories and we can get excited about those. We can get really excited when someone says a ram showed up in a burning bush because we know the story. We're familiar with the story. We're familiar when Moses got exiled, what he was going to be at the end of the story. After Moses committed murder, we know where the story ends. So when we hear these different things about Moses getting exiled, about committing murder, about all these different things, we don't panic because we know the end of the story. So one of the things that I think that we forget, and one of the things that Stephen did so eloquently in this story, is he began to recap history of what God has already done. And the point that I'm making here in regards to recognize the conditions in the text is to be able to identify where you currently are. Recognize the facts. Recognize the fact that the doctor said this is not something that can be cured. Recognize the fact that they said you may lose your job. Recognize the fact that you don't know how you're going to pay next month's bill. It is a reality. So many people, I find it very interesting when people say they're a realist. The only thing they really focus on is the negative of things. And they cover it up by saying, I'm a realist. But the reality of situations is just like there's a negative side, there's also a positive side. So why does it make me no longer a realist to focus on the positive side of things, but it makes you a realist to only focus on the negative side of things? So in recognizing the conditions, one of the things we have to realize is where we are, because that sets the stage and sets the perspective. That's why it was so amazing when Captain studied today, I mentioned perspective and perception. Because the reality of where you are is what sets the perspective and the starting point for where you're going. So that's why the first point is recognize the conditions. Y'all got that? Y'all got that? Y'all put it in your phones? Recognize the conditions. After recognizing the conditions, where we have to move to reconsider the circumstances. Recognize the conditions, but then move from there to reconsidering the circumstances. Because in the midst of standing in a situation where something cannot be cured, the flip side of that is you're in a situation that only God can fix. When you're in a situation where you don't know how you're going to pay the bill next month, you're in a situation that only God can provide. And it points out here, even in the text, in regards to reconsidering the circumstances, because that's what we're able to do when we know the end of the story. We know how things have turned out in the past. So in the midst of something that does not look like it can turn around, that does not look like it can get any better, we have to remember things that we've already seen God do. Whether it's in your life, whether it's in someone else's life, whether it's just the Bible, the stories from the Bible, we have to remember what God has already done. We have to remember that God has a strength that can flip and turn any situation better than we could ever do. Amen. So after recognizing the conditions, we have to move to a place of reconsidering the circumstances. Because that's how we start to move from where we are to where we can be. It starts to create the space. It creates the opportunity. It sets the table. It sets the stage for God to show out. Because as long as you stay in the conditions and stay in the facts and stay where man says you can go, you never begin to be open and receptive to the gift that God is trying to give you. If I try to hand you my phone, but you never put your hand out to take it, what good does it do for me to offer it to you? I'm just sitting here just like this, with something that you may need, with something that you may have even asked for, is the crazy thing about it. That's the thing we don't realize. We're asking for miracles. We're asking for God to break through. We're asking for God to change our lives. But when we get placed in a situation that we don't know how to get out of, now we're panicking. Now we're losing our minds. Now it's chaos. Now it's, I don't know what that man in the White House is doing. Now it's, I don't know what my boss is doing. Now it's, there's no way I can get out of this. But the whole time, God just said, I just handed you a gift. If you'll take it. Because what we're looking at, if you look at the story of Moses and you look at everything that is going on, if you look at where he came from, it's all there in chapter number 7. When you look at everything, when Abraham got the promise of his descendants being able to inherit the land that he was in, you got to keep in mind, he got a promise when he didn't have any children. But we can get excited about situations like that. But when God tells you, I have the car for you, when he tells you, I have the house for you, you're like, but I don't have the credit score. I don't have the down payment. I don't have the credentials to get that job. I don't have enough talent to make the team. Don't worry, I'm coming down here, bro. I don't have the personality to make friends. I don't have these different things that go with the promise that you just gave me. So God, it doesn't make sense. I don't understand the promise that you're giving me. I don't understand what you're trying to hand me because it doesn't fit my conditions. But the thing you got to move from the conditions is the circumstances. Because the circumstances of the situation is the opportunity. But we get stuck in the facts. We get stuck in what's right in front of us. We can't see around it, past it, through it, over it, whatever you may need to do. You're stuck. And I'm simply here to encourage someone, regardless of what's going on in your life right now. The same way Abraham, Jacob, Moses, the way he made a way for all of them, the way he made a way for your mom. A lot of us don't know the power and the strength of a grandmother's or a mother's prayer. But luckily, us in here, most of us do. Because that's the only thing that kept some of us. But the amazing thing about it is that same God that she served, that same God that she prayed to all night, that same God that she cried out to all night, is still there waiting for you. He's still waiting on you to take that gift that he's trying to hand you. He's still waiting. Are we going to leave him there waiting? Is the question that I have for everyone here today. Because the very first verse that we read, it said 40 years later. Mind you, those 40 years were a total of 400 years from the promise. The promise that was given, and that's just the time that was in slavery. That's not going back to Abraham, because Abraham lived a long time. So that's not even going back to when Abraham actually got the promise. Those 400 years were just the time of slavery. And when you really sit there and look at the conditions and switch them to circumstances, you'll begin to realize that God is moving in your life already. Because Moses was born into an environment that every firstborn male child, every male child was being killed. So the amazing thing about that, where most of us would panic, that was the setup for the miracle. Because had not all of the male childs have a death sentence on them, Moses would have never had the opportunity to grow up in the palace. Had he never had an opportunity to grow up in the palace, he would have never learned the customs and the language and the traditions for the setup for his purpose. It all pieces and works together because he grew up in the palace and learned the traditions, learned the customs, learned how to speak their language. But he was still what he was born as. So now his territory has been enlarged. So then he gets to a point in the text where he sees his family. And although he's learned all these different things, although we've gotten a bachelor's degree, although we've gotten a master's, although we've gotten this certification, although we've gotten this job, instincts of who God made me to be still kicked in at some point. To the point where he had to stand in what he was made for. And that was the setup for him to even get kicked out, well, leave, / get kicked out of where he had been his whole life. Mind you, these are a lot of bad situations. Most of us going through these situations would have lost our mind and gave up a long time ago in Moses' story. He left, he's out there, he got married. He's like, Jesus, I got a good life now. I'm out here, I got me a wife. My father-in-law is treating me real good. You know, that don't happen very often. Got me a good father-in-law that's actually like, man, I like him. So it's like, wow, okay. I'm out here taking care of sheep. Yet and still, even the taking care of the sheep was the setup for his purpose. He grew up in a palace, and now he's out taking care of sheep. Most of us would view that as a demotion. I don't know if y'all have ever actually seen videos of sheep. They're not those pretty little white things that we're used to seeing in pictures that we count that are going over a fence. It's like 1, 2, 3. As we're trying to go to sleep, that's not what sheep really are. Sheep stink. They're stubborn. They don't listen to anything that you try to tell them to do. They're very hard to control. Very hard to lead, and you have so many of them that you have to keep all of them in control. All of those stubborn little Negroes, all of them. You got to keep all of them together to get the goal done. And then if one steers off, and you have 100, you got 99. You got to keep together while going to get one. But all of that, as he went through all of that, mind you, it said 40 years later, after he's gotten to a point where he's mastered that, I've learned how to deal with these little people. Now, you show up in a bush that's on fire. Well, God, I wasn't really looking for this right now. I was good. I was happy with this. I'm all right. I got me a nice little place to live, nice little family. I'm fine right here, God. I finally got to a place where I'm okay with where you've placed me. But those are the conditions. And we have to look at the circumstances. Because at that moment, at the right time, it all makes sense. And at that moment is where God said, take off your sandals. Which brings me to my last point. Any of us ever had that grandma, that auntie that was like, don't have your shoes on my carpet? Let's take it even further. You can't even sit your behind on the couch. That plastic sitting right there. Who thought that was a good idea? To buy a couch and say, I want the couch in my house, but I'm going to keep it in the covering that I had on it so that it can stay clean. So that it make sure your nasty behind don't get nothing on there. Sit on this plastic right here. But the point of all of it was respect. So when he says, take off your sandals, take off your shoes. When you come in my house, take your shoes off. That is a sign of respect. To bring it to the last point of revere the Christ. Revere, which means respect the Savior. In all of that, as you start with the conditions, as you start with where you are, as you start with the reality, and then you move from reality to a place of opportunity, you create the space and the opportunity for miracles, signs, and wonders. Then at that point, you have to welcome the Savior in. You have to allow him to take over the situation. And you have to be in a place where you're okay with however it turns out. As I mentioned at the very beginning, Stephen was on trial for speaking out against Moses. He sat there and gave this entire dissertation about Moses and showed the education and everything that he knew about Moses. And he was in a place, it's continuously mentioned throughout the text, that Stephen was a man of faith. Mentioned it 2 or 3 times, that Stephen was a man of faith, that he believed. So as he stands there boldly proclaiming what God has already done, he's on trial, and he's saying this is what God can do, in a place of believing that God is going to do it. At the end of it all, not to be the bearer of bad news, he ended up dying. At the end of all of that. So that's where you have to learn to get to a place where you have that faith and that confidence, where you trust what God is doing, because Stephen's death, one of the members of the people that were stoning Stephen and killing Stephen was a man named Saul. It was a man named Saul that went on from that very death to persecute all of the members of the Christian faith. And who knows, that moment may have even been the catalyst, because that's where Saul is mentioned. It just said Saul was one. And if we all know who Saul is, Saul changed his name a little bit later in the Bible to Paul. Paul is known as the author for majority of the New Testament. So the point of all of this in regards to recognizing the conditions, reconsidering the circumstances, and revering the Christ is a place of trust and respect that no matter what you do, God, I know Romans 8:28, that all things work together for the good of those that, one, love him and have a purpose. He's going to use every condition, every circumstance, every thought, every tear, everything that we go through to actually complete the purpose and the design. So as we go through this week, as we go through this year, as we go through this month, as we go through everything that we're going through, we have to understand that at the right time, it will all make sense. As long as we recognize where we are, reconsider what God can do about it, and then allow him in to where he can actually work. And that is the conclusion of my message for today.